If the SEC breaks up with the NCAA, I'm not sure what that means for college football, but I do think it would be good for Missouri.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And on today's program, I'm going to talk about the latest high school recruit on the gridiron for Missouri, as well as a little bit more on the Sophie Cunningham situation, story, and well, BS. How about I'll just call it what it really is. But you know what, quickly I want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. And I gotta say, this time of year, well, it's often a little bit slow in the college football world. In fact, the SEC meetings happening right now, usually it's a lot of golf and a lot of cocktails, I would think, happening normally. You know, arguing about, hey, 8 versus 9 SEC schedule, about the most serious thing happening. But this time of year, in fact, in 2025, this may be the most consequential SEC meetings ever because, well, according to Ross Dellinger, a former Columbia Daily Tribune guy who now is a national college football reporter for Yahoo covering the sport, I'd say as well as anybody out there. But as Dellinger puts it here, he says, quote, in an unreported and little-known fact, SEC presidents in March quietly authorized their commissioner, Greg Sankey, to split from the NCAA if he deems that the right move. So what does that tell you? That tells you that at least the possibility of a super league, if you will, the Big Ten and the SEC splitting off from the NCAA, possibly bringing some more teams with them and, well, basically doing an NFL-light model truly, it could be closer than we actually think. And I'll get into all of the reasons for why that is, what that could potentially mean for Mizzou, why I think that is actually good for Mizzou if it comes to that. But because here's the thing, Missouri is cooking. Mizzou football is kind of cooking at the right time right now, just like it was when the Tigers joined the SEC circa 2011. I'll get into more of why that was such an important move with the benefit of hindsight. But the reason that all of this is so important and that we're having a potential really monumental moment here in college football is because actually the SEC and the Big Ten, which fans are always arguing amongst each other well, who's really ruining college football and who is the best conference, of course. Well, in fact, behind the scenes, the big power brokers in the conference are on the same page, at least for 2026 and beyond, speaking of the college football playoff format. Now, before I even get into the future, let's talk about the more immediate future, just so we're all on the same page here. For 2025, it's still going to be a 12-team playoff, but the format's going to look a little bit different. There's going to be direct seeding there 1 through 12. There's going to be no automatic, hey, the top 4 goes to the conference championships. Well, the champions of those 4 major conferences still going to be in there. The 5th group of 5 team as well going to be in there, but they're all just going to be seeded 1 through 12 as the committee sees it. But this, according to all of not only Ross Dellinger out there, but also Brandon Marcello at CBS as well. Well, basically, we're looking at 2 wildly different formats here for the coming 16-team playoff format. Yes, the 12-team model is going to survive exactly 2 years before we expand it to something else. So, in fact, all of the big players agree that, hey, we want to go to 16. The problem is, The SEC and the Big Ten want to guarantee themselves an outsized amount of guaranteed automatic qualifiers. In fact, the Big Ten and the SEC each want 4 automatic qualifiers each for their respective conferences. So 4 SEC teams, 4 Big Ten teams would automatically be in the college football playoff. This along with 2 ACC teams, 2 Big 12 teams, a group of 5 qualifier, and then 3 other at-large teams. Well, while the SEC and the Big Ten are on the same page for this format, it's actually the Big 12 and the ACC saying, actually, we'd like to have the top 5 plus 11 format. In other words, 5 automatic qualifiers and then 11 at-large bids. Understandably, the ACC and the Big 12 would prefer this as it is more equitable from their perspective. The problem is, I'm just not sure that their opinion really matters much at this point, because if the SEC and the Big 10 are on the same page, what does it matter what the ACC and the Big 12 really say? Because clearly all of the conferences, by the way, not just the Big 2, but the Big 12 and the ACC are certainly guilty of this as well. They all have their hands in murdering the Pac-12, though I will say the Big 10 is probably the biggest culprit there. But regardless, the point here, whether you like any of that or not, the big power players here are very obvious, and if they're aligned, I think if you're in the ACC, if you're in the Big 12, and you're thinking, gosh, what if all of this does collapse? We don't want to overplay our hand here if you're, say, Clemson or Florida State, for example, and you're thinking, well, they're probably going to end up at maybe 40 teams or something like that. If there is indeed an NFL-like Super League coming, you better start jockeying for position to get into said league, even if you're Notre Dame, quite honestly, because, again, the SEC and the Big Ten, I think they'd love to have Notre Dame and Clemson and Florida State come along for all of this and bring those big brands and their eyeballs with them, but only under the right circumstances, only under the circumstances that benefit the SEC and the Big Ten as they see it. That seems like this is the true new alliance for all the talk of, well, the Big Ten's going to have an alliance with this, that, or the other. Right now, the SEC and the Big Ten are aligned, and that should be frightening for the rest of the power brokers in college football. So once again, and this is making a lot of assumptions here, if a Super League does come to fruition, I do think it would actually be advantageous for the Missouri Tigers, simply because I think more of an NFL-like model would probably even the playing field a little bit. And because Missouri was wise enough and maybe lucky enough in a lot of different ways as well to have joined the SEC about 14 or 15 years ago now, well, Missouri is now in the catbird seat along with everybody else who is in those 2 conferences. So for all of the people out there who may have still had personal preferences, and I can certainly see the argument for this in a bunch of ways of being in the old Big 8 or the old Big 12, the bottom line here is if Missouri was still sitting in this new conglomeration that is the Big 12, well, we'd be sitting in very, very uncertain waters. And instead, again, Missouri is in the catbird seat. And worst case scenario, I guess, depending if you're a college football traditionalist, if the whole thing collapses, the NCAA is seceded from, essentially, well, I still think from just a competitive perspective, I don't think it's going to be bad for Missouri whatsoever, because for decades and basically for time immemorial, well, Missouri has been behind the 8 ball in terms of just the competitive structure of college football, especially when it comes to money and everything else. So if you have a little bit more of a parity type of structure, an NFL type of structure, that it sure seems like, hey, the more even you make the playing field, the more eyeballs come to your sport. That's certainly what the NFL would tell you. If that is indeed the the hypothesis, I think it's a good one for the Missouri Tigers in the future. So whether or not that's good for the future of college football or not, I'm not really sure. I just don't really see how it can bite Missouri in the rear end at this point. Somebody explain to me what I'm missing if that is indeed the case. But I'll tell you, I could have been missing something when I was talking about whether the SEC should go from 8 to 9 in this previous couple off seasons. I'd assume that was kind of inevitable at a certain point, but now that looks very much up in the air. And at the very least, the SEC is going to use it as a huge bargaining chip to, again, further change the structure of college football moving forward. So a real radical idea, one that makes a lot of sense, but I don't know that I'm in love with it either. Let's talk about it coming forward, how the SEC could totally and radically change conference championship weekend. And again, how does this affect the Missouri Tigers, most importantly? Let's talk about that here in just a little bit. But first, of course, the NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night just delivering great basketball lately. And whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there really has never been a better time to get in on the action. And FanDuel is the best place, of course, both before the tip-off and live. And tonight, the Oklahoma City Thunder -8.5 at home could close out the Timberwolves tonight. I think this one kind of comes down to energy. Do you think the Wolves have given up? If they have a chance, if they have enough energy, I think they'll cover the spread. But, man, OKC is just the better team. They're probably going to win the championship right now. But regardless, if you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. So for at least a couple off seasons now, SEC fans and podcasters like myself have been talking about 8 versus 9, 8 conference games or 9 conference games. And again, back to the squabble between SEC and Big Ten fans and also Big 12 fans and others in this case saying, oh, you guys in the SEC, you don't play a real schedule because you don't get to 9 conference games like we do. Well, we can parse that all we want. The reality is, I think something I didn't realize is that as I assumed, I think my first assumption was right that, yes, eventually we'll get to 9. I think that was correct. I think what I missed is that, well, the SEC was going to use that last conference game, that extra conference game, I should say, as a real bit of bargaining and leverage, because the SEC very much seems married to what people are calling a play-in scenario for those last 2 conference qualifiers. Again, the SEC and the Big Ten right now, their suggestion is 4 automatic qualifiers for each of those conferences. So what would happen is the SEC in the SEC championship, the number 1 and number 2 would still play in Atlanta for the SEC title. But what would also happen that same weekend, tripling, by the way, your amount of inventory for said weekend, and this is why, indeed, the SEC is really married to this, but you'd have the 3rd team taking on the 6th place team in the SEC, and the 4th team taking on the 5th team for those final 2 qualifying spots. So the number 1 and number 2 that play for the SEC title, they'd still get in, regardless of who won that game and took home the SEC crown. The one thing I don't like about this, I have to admit, is that it doesn't really fix the problem of, wait a second, do I really want to put out my best effort if I'm the 1 or 2 team here? Again, in my world, yes, the SEC championship, any conference championship, is worth just about everything. But in this new world where seemingly the playoff is everything, that calculation is changing a little bit, seemingly, with each and every year. But again, this is the whole thing here. This is the problem, I think, even more so with guaranteeing 1 for each conference, because as Sankey has pointed out, well, hey, and others have pointed out, there are some other years where actually the 5 plus 11. Well, there might even be more SEC teams in there than what would be with the automatic qualifiers in there. There's some seasons when the Big 12 and the ACC don't really deserve two automatic qualifiers is the big sticking point there. But again, it seems like the SEC, that's not the problem here. The problem is, according to one school administrator here, this is from Dellinger, quote, "It doesn't allow us to do the play-in games, and I'm not sure we'd have the votes for a 9th conference game either." So it seems like, again, everybody in the league here holding out. Hey, we'll give you that 9th conference game. Sounds good. And it would be a win-win revenue-wise because not only you get that extra money from ESPN, Disney, for example, for that extra inventory, but man, even more just primo inventory. Those 2 extra SEC play-in games would surely do just massive numbers, approaching or maybe even surpassing what is usually a 20-25 type rating for the SEC championship game. So money-wise, it sure seems like a win-win. And most importantly, I think from Missouri's perspective, now you're telling me that Missouri needs to essentially get in the top 6 of the SEC for a shot at the college football playoff. That's pretty interesting to me as a Missouri fan. And again, if this is the format that we're going for here, well, it's certainly going to be that 13th week if Missouri is indeed a 5 or 6 seed, or of course, obviously a 1 or a 2. But I'm just saying, being a 5th or a 6th place team in the SEC suddenly just got a heck of a lot more interesting, I would say. I got to admit that, no matter what else you think about it. And objectively, it also gives Missouri a better chance to get into the college football playoff, which, once again, seems like all anybody cares about these days. So from a Missouri perspective, seems like mostly a win. So once again, just to recap, I know I've thrown a lot at you here the first couple segments here. For 2025, for this upcoming season, still a 12-team playoff, just a little bit different format versus last year. 1 through 12, the straight seeding. For 2026 and beyond, well, technically it's still up in the air, I would say. But as far as I can tell, I don't see any way that the Big Ten and the SEC don't get what they want. So the 4 automatic qualifiers from each of the Big Ten and the SEC, 2 for the Big 12, 2 for the ACC, 1 for the group of 5, and then the rest are at large. I think that's where we're headed. I really do, simply because of the power structure of all of this good stuff. Now, I will say this, a source familiar with the playoff discussions did say the ACC and the Big 12, again, this is Dellinger's piece, quote, "prepared to fight and will not lay down." I say that's cute. I really do. Sounds good on paper, but to me, I just find it hard to believe that that is a power battle that anybody at the Big 12 or the ACC is ultimately going to win. I also think it's interesting that Greg Sankey said that, hey, mentioned that pro leagues typically have 30 or 32 teams. Well, 16 plus 18, that's the amount in the SEC plus the Big 10. That's 34 teams. Again, I think we could get to 40 in this hypothetical scenario. That doesn't leave a lot of room, a lot of spots left on the life raft, that's for sure. Missouri overplayed its hand, I would say, perhaps with the Big Ten all those years ago. Well, then it shut up and went along with whatever the SEC wanted, and wisely so. Look at where Missouri is sitting today in a much, much, much better spot than what its peers of the Big 12 North that remained in the conference are right now. If you're Kansas, if you're Iowa State, if you're Kansas State, you're nervous right now. If you're Missouri, you're in the catbird seat. So that alone, I should say, should help you sleep a lot at night as a Tiger fan. And Keenan Harris is the latest addition to Missouri's high school recruiting class for 2026. And well, a bit of a needed one just in terms of quantity, but also quality as well. A 4-star kid. Let's talk about him right after these quick words. So Keenan Harris, your latest addition for Missouri Tigers, at least a verbal addition. Still a long way to go when it comes to high school recruiting these days, and indeed some scheduled visits to Iowa and Oklahoma still on the docket, at least for the moment, though one might assume those visits could be canceled at a certain point. The point here really is that for me to be bringing up a high school recruit in the final segment of the show kind of tells you where interest in high school recruiting is at the very moment. Now, he's a promising young athlete for certain, 6'1", 210 pounds, 4-star composite type player. Played safety in high school, I believe. At least he was listed as a safety, but Missouri is recruiting him as a linebacker reportedly. But again, it's just kind of hard to get terribly excited about high school recruiting in the transfer portal era, and it certainly seems like Missouri is transferring a lot of its resources to the portal side versus the high school side. Doesn't mean Missouri is giving up on high school recruits, but obviously, like a lot of other teams with portal resources, Missouri is certainly not focusing as much on high school. They're not trying to bang their heads against the wall for certain guys who, like Williams Winery and Courtney Crutchfield, some guys who definitely were not cheap, and they came to Missouri for 1 year, had essentially no production, and left. The thing is, regardless of what you think of the portal, your shooting percentage, your field goal percentage is going to be a lot higher on the portal than it is on high school kids. Simply put, you think about a guy who played at Michigan State, for instance, somebody like Zion Young. Pretty obvious that whatever his production was at the Big Ten level, you've got a pretty good idea of what it's going to be at the SEC level as well, whereas high school to the SEC is such a massive jump, and usually you're talking about not just the competition jump, but you're having to project forward 2 to 3 years as well, because very few of those guys are going to be playing immediately. And obviously, if you're Missouri, from Eli Drinkwitz's perspective, if I can't count on you, or at least think that you have a shot to play immediately, then my resources are probably better used in the transfer portal. Or another way of put that would be production over potential, as Eli Drinkwitz has said. And by the way, just to close out the show here, I do want to point out, yes, my previous episode, a lot of it was about Sophie Cunningham, what I thought was just the embarrassing and revolting coverage of utter rumors that were just profligated out there by Yahoo, TMZ, the New York Post, and others. Well, Sophie and the Phoenix Suns all came out and denied it about as strongly as you possibly could have. And what I've noticed as somebody who follows Sophie Cunningham is that, guess what? In the wake of her comments, she has continued to be exactly the same person in public as she was before. Good, bad, or indifferent, no matter what you think of Sophie Cunningham, I happen to be a gigantic fan of hers. But the point is, she has not changed the way she's acted in public at all. And that just, to me, that's somebody that's how an innocent person acts. So all of this stuff that was thrown out about her, I don't believe it. She's denied it. A true daughter is Sophie Cunningham. Good for you, and good for you for sticking with me here on Locked On Mizzou on today's episode. Appreciate you being an everydayer and for making this show your first listen every day. Hey, for your second listen, check out Locked On the Portal. Brian Smith, the Scout Master, our buddy's got the rumors, your latest signings. You can be the most informed college football fan if you just listen to Brian. Find the Portal on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts. So until next time, I'm John Miller. This has been Locked On Mizzou.